Yeah, I think conservatively, tens of billions of medicines, effective medicines, are made but never used. And there are a whole variety of reasons why that happens, and it happens at every part of the supply chain.
Hello, and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. This is the show where we share tools and tactics and insights from our work with industry leaders on decarbonizing the healthcare sector. My name is Frederick van Deurs. I am the CEO of Green Innovation Group. And today I have with me Nazneen. And Nazneen, I was struggling with how I wanted to present you on the show. And I mean, your CV is just so long and with so many interesting areas that if I just start with you graduated from University of Oxford as studying medicine, then you have a PhD in molecular genetics. I think you have to be somewhat smart to do that. You worked for 13 years in cancer research. You've been and is a non-exec at AstraZeneca. You're working with UMaker, and you're also a musician on the side. So I was just, figuring there were so many items on that list that I could pick out and say, okay, this is super interesting. I could talk for hours about that. This is super interesting. I could talk about for hours about that. Um, so I figured maybe you you would like to attach a few words on what is it you do and why is it important?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be on the podcast. I should be able to talk about a few things, but are dear to my heart. I think at a very high level, what I like to do is to make things that are both useful and ideally have some beauty to them. I think that beauty often comes in simplicity. It makes something work better or bring pleasure in that working, and then to scale that so that it can have as much impact and help as many people as possible. That's been the sort of drive across all of the different things that I've done. So and currently, really, my passion has been about the sort of broad sustainability agenda. Obviously, decarbonisation and climate crisis is absolutely central there. But this vision of a world where humans can act in ways that are good for people, but for planet, bringing prosperity, and how we can make that work for healthcare.
Can you tell us sort of what is the brief introduction to UMaker? What is it that UMaker does?
So UMaker does have this central ambition of trying to make healthcare more sustainable, good for people, planet, good for the business of healthcare. And in essence, the reason it has that focus is that we are in a sort of decade of action. I like being at the heart of action when we moved from period of activism or change, really people in the for like modern solutions. And in order to make healthcare more sustainable, you have to get that trinity working together. And we have that opportunity, I think, of having perhaps the low hanging fruit, which can really drive all of those exemplars. So that's what I set it up to do. And we really have ended up doing two things. We build technology. I come from genomics, as you said, so data and leveraging data has always been a core to what the sorts of things I build. And then we build partnerships because it really felt that we needed a new way, a radical way of collaborating within healthcare if we were going to have action. So those are the two things we're doing. The technology that we've really been driving forward is a tool called NCF Classifier, which is around practical ways of building medicine carbon footprints into how we optimize medicines use and procurement. And then the Sustainable Medicines Partnership, which is an action collaborative focused on reducing waste of medicines, waste from medicines. That's why we chose that focus.
I think that made it a bit clearer. I'm really curious about this. I find that a lot of people that work in this industry on the sustainability agenda, they usually have an origin story that kind of led them into that arena of passion and into that field of work. So what was your own journey? How did you grow up to become passionate about sustainability?
Well, I think I was passionate about it without sort of naming it as sustainability. I've always been interested in prevention. A lot of what drew me to genomics was that opportunity. I've always been really interested in how systems change, um, and I think that issue around sustainability really helps to draw those things together. I've always been really interested in equity and access, and thinking
Mm-hmm.
about the sweet spots where you can do one thing that will actually lead to all of those things. So I had sort of been interested in it sort of tangentially, and I'd sort of brought it into lots of different things that I'd done. But I think in this decade, and it really was the turn of the decade, but it felt like I wanted to have that as my focus, really commit. And I suppose that 2020 felt like, what am I going to do in this decade? Like many people. And it's sort of in my sort of career cycle, it came to time. And I really sort of wanted to, and again, when you get to a certain age, you have earned to a certain extent the right to think about what am I actively going to do. I think when we're younger, certainly for me, I was reactive. I fell into one thing or another, and I did my best there to drive change as well as I could and to be as effective as possible. But I hadn't actively chosen. And here at this stage of my career, I wanted to spend this decade and think, what do I want to put my commitment to? And that brought me to the sustainability. But also, if you're a change maker, you really need to ride the zeitgeist. And I could see in 2020 a little bit, as I saw in 2010 around what genomics was doing there, that this could be the decade where we needed to have action, and we potentially could, because forces were aligning so that people could recognize that we needed action there. So it was a combination of my passion and things that I wanted to work on, but also feeling that it was a fertile time, that this was the time to really move forward, that had led to these.
I feel like you're really addressing something about running in the tracks that are put in front of you as society and corporates and organizations kind of nudge and nurture young individuals to go and get an education, go into the labor market, go and execute, go do. But then later on, having built on that experience, you were actually able to navigate that with your own intention rather than sort of, running in the track that's put out in front of you. So I find that angle really, really interesting, and something that I think many people of the younger generations are, I at least observe a reluctance to accept those premises that you have to do what's put in front of you, but you can actually change it earlier. And I think that's part of the reason why we see such a youth movement in climate change with Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, that there's actually a deep desire for changing things at a systemic level in the young generations. And I think having someone with more professional experience like you to guide that way and guide those actions is really, really powerful. When you described UMaker before, you talked about having two different models. So one of them being around data and one of them being around partnerships. Is UMaker, is that working as an NGO or is it a private entity? Can you walk our audience through how is it set up so they understand what it is and what it does for whom?
Yes, in part, I sort of set up UMaker to give me the freedom to just set up what was the best way to deliver what I was trying to achieve in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I've been part of every different type of structure, from corporate to academic to all of those. And I think they all have their strengths, but they also all have their constraints. And I think one of the things about building the world that we want to move forward in is thinking about which bits of the old world we want to use because they're working for us now, and which ones are too constraining. So I sort of just set it up with an idea, and we have these two different elements. So the partnership runs I would call it a purpose-driven organization, but it's a straightforward company on that side. But we have these two separate but very aligned aspects. So the Sustainable Medicines Partnership is a not-for-profit collaboration amongst now 48 different organizations, and the corporate members of those pay in over the years a subscription that allows you maybe to run that. But all of the money within that will be used just for that. The MCF Classifier, the technology and software we're building as a technology company, and we will roll that out with in a sort of standard way, which will be commercialize it.
What does that mean? You say it's an MCR classifier.
Sorry,
what is that acronym?
So MCF, acronym's terrible. MCF stands for Medicine Carbon Footprint Classifier. So one of the things we did when we first started was we sort of articulated what we call the pillars of sustainable medicines, and a lot of what we're doing, we're trying to build together these big collaborations across the whole sector, is to identify sort of narrative frameworks almost that allow people to feel that it's relevant to them, that they have agency and sort of urgency around that. So in part, that's why we settled on this focus of wanting to reduce the waste of medicines and the waste from medicines. So about 4.5 trillion medicines are made every year, but billions are just never used. They're made and destroyed. And every part of the supply chain, though that happens, it's hidden in plain sight. Every part of it would like that to happen less, at least, but nobody can sort of do it on their own. And underlying that, you have to make things more cost effective, more carbon effective. It allows you a window in, and everyone hates waste, so it's a real way of bringing those together.
Do you have an idea of the scale of this problem of medicine waste at a global level? How big is the problem?
Yeah, I think conservatively, tens of billions of medicines, effective medicines, are made but never used. And there are a whole variety of reasons why that happens, and it happens at every part of the supply chain. Now, of course, you do need to have surplus in the system, because we want to ensure that you don't have a break in delivery of your medicine. Yeah. So part of that is I think perhaps an over-conservatism about that surplus, and not leveraging what we can do with sort of science, predictive science, and inventory science in the way that people have done, say, for the food industry, to sort of optimize. And so some of that is that surplus. But because we're talking about such big numbers, and sort of trillions of medicines being made, even small amounts end up being large. Another key aspect is the conservatism of expiry dates. So the expiry dates are not expiry dates, and they're not when the medicines stop being effective. They are the date at which that approval, which a manufacturer has guaranteed approval. There's lots and lots of really robust science saying that 90% of expiry dates are very conservative, 5 years or more.
I think that is the most low-hanging fruit that I have identified in this agenda about preventing medicine waste, right? That because technically this is humans making laws and regulation that can be undone if we wanted to. As I'm a trained anthropologist, so I also have that angle that all of these structures are also in a way something that could qualify as religious systems that we put a lot of belief in, we invest a lot of belief in it, and that belief is also what's maintaining our society as it is, because we have to have a sort of societal contract where we believe the rules are there for a reason, and we're not supposed to circumvent those rules, and we're not supposed to change those rules too much. But in this case, when we're talking about expiry dates of also medtech devices have very short expiry dates, but for both drugs and for devices, it just seems to me like the one thing that overnight could sort of prevent the largest quantity of waste in the entire healthcare industry.
Well, I agree with you on particularly on this the sort of contract and the social contract, and confidence is so important in healthcare. We don't want to take risks with our own health, we particularly don't want to take risks with our loved one's health. So that confidence aspect of it, and that safety aspect is really key. So I think that I think some changes can happen overnight. One change that could happen overnight is the belief that this is something that we should reevaluate and potentially change. The actually actioning of it, I think, would need to have a longer trajectory, partly because of the way it's based in both regulation and legislation. And those two things can't change overnight. But I think the intention could change. I think then what's central to that is this idea of safety. And when the original regulations were set up, the primary safety issue that one was considering is what is the risk to the individual who's taking that medicine of taking that medicine. That was the whole context of that risk. And let's be any theoretical risk, let's try and avoid it. It's extremely conservative in that regard, and really focusing on that individual. What wasn't put into that, and which I think would be really interesting to consider now, is what is the risk to that person on because of the contribution that healthcare is making to climate change, pollution, all of these things, because a lot of these wasted medicines end up just being thrown away. And should we be putting into the risk estimate for the individual in front of you that broader risk? Should we be putting into that the risk to the planet and the knock-on things there? So a re-evaluation of that risk and that risk-benefit ratio, and then pulling into that also our ability to add in predictions about how you can decide whether things are safe or not. So I think there are some central conceptual ways in which we think about it that could happen overnight and would be really helpful. But the actual driving out of policies, I think, could take a bit longer. There is some low-hanging fruit there. Different health systems have different ways of allowing people, for example, to extend their shelf life. But currently, every incentive is against that. The last thing people want to do is go back to regulators and say, "Oh, can we do that?" If that's going to add time, money, delay things. So we don't have a permissive environment to allow people to try change that.
Yeah, and I think the urgency is not escalated enough in sort of the lived realities of enough individuals that we're actually escalating it. But we saw with COVID-19 that we were in fact able to move quite a lot, quite fast when we had something. I mean, early days, it was just a huge unknown that was perceived as a massive risk to society, and that made a lot of things possible. And I think it's really interesting to see that the World WHO come out and say climate change is actually a massive driver for global deaths at an annual level, that we do need to consider that when we have the patriotic oath and we can do no harm. I feel the entire industry has been wired and geared towards efficiency and safety in the drug and treatment delivery. And then the sustainability angle has kind of been sidelined because we're saving human lives, or we're working with people that have either chronic disease or disease. So we're saving lives, so we're improving lives. So sustainability can take a back seat and get a seat in an ESG or a CSR report somewhere. And in recent times, one of those developments that we're actually starting to consider, okay, if the healthcare sector is responsible for 5% of the global CO2 emissions, and it's only projected to grow as populations grow older and the middle class grows larger, the demand for healthcare services is only going to increase, then we do need to drastically reduce the emissions from this sector if it's not going to have a negative impact, sort of by contributing so much to the main driver for climate change and the main driver for decreased health, particularly in poorer areas. So I'm just really curious about all of these agendas that you're bringing up. So we've been talking about decarbonization and prevention and all of those partnerships to prevent medicinal waste. We've talked about the expiry dates of drugs, but I'm really curious when you have this carbon footprint data software that who is it can help? Is that a pharmaceutical company that's producing a drug, or is it a hospital that is purchasing a drug for its patients? Who are you? Can you maybe walk us through a client journey? What does it look like? Who's the person that's buying the service, and what is it they get?
Yeah, yes, I'll do that. I'd love to just pick up on the COVID-19 example, if I may, from that, because I think it exemplifies, um, I think there are lessons there that we can really helpfully learn. So, say with respect to the expiry dates or not wasting medicines. So, I was, like many people, as a vaccinator, and in certainly in the UK, when we had those vaccine rollout, every last dose in the vial, we would find an arm to put in. And you could get 11 doses, but sometimes you could get 12, and we'd always want to get 12, and we would find an arm. And it felt society had really sort of voted there with their feet and with their voices, and saying we don't want to waste that. And so we can apply that, I think, reasonably enough. And I think people, as it's hidden in plain sight problem, people aren't aware the extreme amount of waste that's happening. Say for cancer drugs, just the way they are, a lot of money, a lot of drugs at the bottom of those vials that we have to throw away. So I think we can learn from that. I think the other thing that is we learn from the COVID-19 is that, and still I think we struggle because it's a human struggle. What the pandemic did is turn a problem that all of the foresight, and we knew we would do a pandemic, but it was in the future. Once it became an urgent thing that we had to deal with today, then we were fantastic. The ingenuity, the speed, the collaboration. When it becomes a crisis, we're there. But when we know it's going to be a crisis, but it's in the future, and the further in the future it is, we just can't make ourselves be there.
We become
really
apathetic somehow, right?
I don't think it's apathy. I think, well, from a personal perspective, I've got all this on my to-do list. I've got the stuff I need to do today. There's all the stuff I should have done yesterday that I didn't do. You know, the stuff I can do tomorrow, I'm so sorry. That has to, so somehow has to feel, we have to make it relevant to today, because that's just how we're primed. So, and often we sort of say, oh, you know, it's going to cause all these problems tomorrow. And people who have been saying this for years, they're saying, we're telling them what's going to happen, all of the negative impacts. But we have to give people a way, I think, of two things. One, making it feel relevant today. More importantly, I think we have to have things that they can do today that solves the problems for today, but also is addressing that. And that's in part why we focus on things that can make healthcare more clinically effective and more cost effective as well, and addressing the pain points today. So I wanted to just sort of, I think we haven't taken enough time to really articulate the lessons and learn the lessons from COVID-19 and bed down those things that really worked there that we want to sort of drive forward, and before we start sort of pushing it into the past. But in part, in terms of, so MCF classifier, what we were doing there, so let's say it's that's the medicine carbon footprint and classifier. And here it was a way of really trying to bring some practical sustainability metrics into how we're measuring medicine's carbon footprint. So, as probably most of your audience knows, that within a healthcare system, the footprint for medicines is substantial. It's about a quarter of the, estimated to be about a quarter of the NHS's footprint, for example. And the majority of that is in the sort of supply chain, manufacturing the use of our medicines. Now, of course, we have to have medicines. We can't, unless we stop prescribing, it's going to have a footprint. So here it's about that optimization. And for healthcare systems, then it's about choices. How can we make choices, informed choices about what medicines we're going to use? So that's really the first bit that we came into. And there hadn't been a way of actually making those comparisons. So there are two different ways in which people are sort of approaching footprinting. One is the so-called top-down, where you use a spend-based estimate, and you can give a very, very high-level view of a carbon footprint of a country or a sector. But in terms of turning that into practical ways in which you can drive forward change, really, basically, if you spend less, or things being equal and the economy is changing lots, so that isn't quite so that you will reduce your footprint, but that isn't the solution you can have for medicine. Then you have this sort of bottom-up, what's called approach of these LCAs, sort of exquisitely detailed, but currently not comparable because there is plurality in that, and quite legitimately and appropriately, you can do an LCA in a different way in a different organization. And I think as an individual organization doing that to identify the places where you can have maximum impact in your manufacturing and delivery of that makes absolute sense. If you're trying to compare LCAs, we're not really yet there in the methodology, but you start to be comparing not just apples and oranges. You're comparing kind of apples.
You're literally pouring water on our mill here. That's exactly what we are saying, that, just the parameters of the LTA, you can get wildly different results from the same process.
So what we wanted to do there was to have what we've called a sort of middle out approach, where the aim here is to have consistency of approach, recognize and be transparent about the estimates that you're making, but doing that so people can benchmark and compare that. So what we did that for here, and we also wanted to tackle a big proportion of the medicines. So here what we tackled there are essentially synthetic medicines, tablets and capsules. And one of the things that we do have for medicines is we actually know the molecular structure, which you don't have for a table or those things. So we actually have the makeup of those. And we also have 20 years of really excellent science from green chemistry or from drug development. And here there is a beautiful alignment, because if you're reducing the cost of manufacture, and there's usually a process around that as you go from development out to scale, you will almost always reduce the footprint because you're making that process more efficient. So there has been really excellent work and metrics that people are already measuring that then could be lent into how people could move forward. And some low-hanging fruit. Greener solvents would make a huge impact and transition.
So what you just listed there, the greener solvents, who are the ones that could use greener solvents, and what would be a greener solvent?
So I think there are a lot of different solvents. Solvents are required in the cleanup and the manufacture process of medicines. You can have different choices, and you need different solvents for different ones. But there has been really excellent work done by the drug development chemists around which solvents can be used in which situations, and a whole set of solvents which have lower footprint than the pinch. It's almost like a design process equivalent to swapping out your plastics for something that's biodegradable. So I think there are ways in which many farm companies are already working on doing that. The beauty about it is that changing a solvent is very different from changing your manufacturing process and going through and change your things there. So in that sense, it's sort of low-hanging fruit to have a big impact. For us, what we were seeing with health systems, it was essentially, and in the first instance, the NHS, who are wanting to, because they set such strong targets for when they want net zero to be achieved for the health system, a way for which health systems could do what essentially they've been doing for inhalers, having a way of inhalers with a high global warming potential, and lower ones are having a way of that would allow people to make practical choices. So for tablets, which is the majority of medicines that we used, what we've done is taken the validated metrics from new drug development and used a data science approach to apply that at scale to existing medicine. Because though we hear about new medicines being made all the time, that's wonderful. 90% of the medicines we've used for the last 20 years.
The blockbusters, right?
No, not the blockbusters are the sort of the new, we often talk about the sort of $1 billion medicines, blockbusters, and they're usually new medicines that are on patent. and are excellent, and they're driving forward change and cancer medicines. But most of the medicines that we do they're analgesics, they're pain medicines, they're metformins, they're everyday medicines that are generics, they're low cost, but they're high volume. So in terms of that footprint,
I think that's that's a really interesting angle. I think for those of our audience, I mean, to me, it's becoming second nature to talk about NHS and their sustainability ambition. But can you walk us through what was it that NHS set out to do, and why was it significant when it happened?
Yeah, so the NHS has really had a very long history of long before I was in sustainability of sort of thinking that well over a decade, and have been building up an ambition there and knowledge and expertise within that. But in the recent past, there has been a commitment now in legislature, which is obviously for the NHS to become net zero by 2045, and there are very clear signposts along that about things to be achieved around on that journey. So one of those is that by 2028, I think it is, that if you have a product that's being sold within the NHS, that the footprint of that should be available. So that's these sort of hard targets here. All NHS hospitals and trusts had to have a green plan that was outlining what they were going to do, and that was achieved by July last year. That's over 200 trusts. So but also we have a greener NHS unit that's supported, that's able to sort of drive out this integration. So it's a way in which the NHS really has leveraged being an NHS. We also did it with the vaccine rollout. It doesn't work with many things, and lots of things. It's a huge organisation that has all, but there are times when, and this is one of them, where working together, setting the ambition together, helping together to reach those is the only way we can do it, because we either all win or we all lose, but it's a very effective way in which. So what we're doing through NCF Pacifier in two ways is one, giving people health systems. We can give them their emissions. We pulled in all the data on the footprint of the medicines there, but we can pull in the prescription information, cost information, so we can integrate that. And then we can start to benchmark the people consistent methodology and say, this is how you are. This is how you are with your sort of local peers. This is areas where you are sort of below the average. And this is what the top ambitions are doing. And so we can just present people with the information. If you did these three things, it would alter yours footprints by this amount, and give people the opportunity to then make what we call carbon informed sort of decisions. And
really into what you said earlier was that you're really driven by sort of facilitating actions for change, and this having a carbon informed decision making process is really empowering in terms of also just providing the awareness and the knowledge of, if I do this, then it'll have this effect. And one thing that we have seen in the very early days of sustainability work was that the proportion of praise that a very small, insignificant sustainability initiative had was completely blown out of proportions if someone changed the carpets in their office for something recycled fabric like, or something along these lines, where we need to target the material areas where we can decarbonize and not just the good stories that are relatable. I think we do need both, of course. We do need the good stories to raise awareness, but having a carbon-based data set that allows for you to have carbon-based decisions, I think that's super powerful. So thanks a lot for doing that, first of all. I think one thing that is that I'm still struggling with a little bit is sort of the but also because I like business theory and business models. So in UMake, are your clients hospitals, or are they pharmaceutical companies or similar, or drug distributors?
So just for full clarity, we're still in the development phase of NCF classifier. So we'll have a beautiful bit later in this year. So I think that the core data set, can be leveraged in multiple different ways. I think in the first instance, because we've got funding from the NHS, so that we're building this tool that will be will display that information in the way that I've described, alongside the formulary things that are empowering that. I think we're also working in terms of what we can do there is to start have an estimated footprint for individual medicines that manufacturers that can then use, that we can integrate with their performance along scope 1 and scope 2, so that you can have a sort of integrated picture again for them, but also for people sort of starting to look at that. Because I think one has to be careful. We're very seduced by numbers, and to be explicit, we're presenting this information as sort of brag style rating, high, medium, and low, because I think these are estimates. People don't put confidence intervals or data there, so I think people have to get used to that. And just carbon numbers, we still will have to translate it into car journeys or whatever. Numbers we have
this many T-shirts.
We have a sort of so I think that's it's important to have this sort of, still building those sort of frameworks and those narratives. But if you just go down the numbers, you can start to do things that you don't want to do. In essence, a bigger, more complicated medicine will always have a bigger footprint. So what you don't want to do is to penalize manufacturers who happen to be making an insulin or an inhaler, which we need. Particularly if they've been a good manufacturer who have already moved to renewable energy or have already done their electrification of their fleet. So you can't just pick these things in isolation. You have to put them in the context of, if there's only one medicine available for a particular condition, we're going to use that medicine. There are no choices there. And as I say, if it's a medicine that we need and we want to, and there's a manufacturer that's done a lot about their scope 1 and 2, we don't want to penalize them because that drug happens to have a big footprint because it's a very complicated medicine. So you need to have systems that think about this and address that. One, in a way so people understand why you've made those decisions. And there are different approaches you could have. So I think the transparency is key. We're not at a time when we want to be perfection would definitely be enemy of in fact just too hard line about it. But also I think it's really important to bend those into practical things and that are aligning, so it's not new. So we want to bring in within how we are measuring the impact of medicines, where that manufacturer is on scope 1 and scope 2, because even though as we were talking earlier, even though the big companies have been making good progress, there's a very, very long tail. And the majority of manufacturers are really very early on, and many of them have yet to start. And we have to raise the floor. And the ceiling can go as high as it likes, and it's great to have the inspiration, but we have to get that floor up so that we've got all of the manufacturers being able to manufacture their medicines, which is a complex, intensive process.
For sure. No, I definitely feel you on that one. We're working now with a global pharmaceutical company on basically integrating the operating model that will allow for the green transition of all of their manufacturing sites. And it's a global manufacturing organization that has sites basically all over the world. And one of the things that we see is that this process is just so complex, it's so regulated, there are so many conditions and preconditions at stake that it can be really, really difficult to change. And therefore a systematic approach is also what's needed from an organizational level, that if you want to move closer towards greener manufacturing, you really need a systems approach. You need to be able to break it down into smaller problems that can be solved, and that you can allocate budget, time, and resources to solve and integrate into the KPIs of the performance of that site. Because at the end of the day, a manufacturing site is all about getting the product out so the patient can have it. And you know, those are the key concerns at a production level. So you really need to go into what you addressed earlier, that, you know, the sustainability angle has to help the audience solve problems today that are also contributing to solving the problem in the more distant future, but it really has to integrate into the performance that they need to sort of show on a daily basis. Because if not, it becomes an add-on, and then it gets discarded, as you said, with the stuff you're doing tomorrow that you can't even spend time doing today, and you know, add to that list of stuff you didn't make to do yesterday. So you know, I think you're really talking into that complex mess of human life and organization that is also a part of what is preventing our action here. And that strong feeling of inaction is of course also the vast complexity of the issue. But you mentioned earlier prevention as well, and I'm sure you'd agree that prevention is probably the one of the best drivers for decarbonization. If I mean, the best treatment is the one that we don't have to give, from a carbon perspective at least. So what is your take in Umega on prevention? How are you approaching that?
Yeah, so I think that again, prevention sort of is on this. It touches a little bit with humanity not wanting to think about bad things that might happen tomorrow. So we have to sort of generally. So and we hear a lot about sort of anxiety and things. So we don't want to. I think at this stage it would be great to, as you say, empower people, you know, agency, and that's as true about climate change as it is about, and it's also true about health. And to a certain extent, the way health sort of developed over the centuries is we sort of devolved agency. We sort of said, okay, we won't think about this, and when we're ill, we'll go to a doctor and they'll somehow fix us. So I think there is a sort of cultural change about being able to that agency. Again, prevention is obviously a very complex issue around in healthcare, but that also means complexity also means there's many, many, many different ways in which one can enter into that. So it also gives you huge opportunities. I think the way that, and again, because we've had this focus on medicines as being as our exemplar, and again, we want to ride the sort of zeitgeist, this our problems for today that people are focused on. The issue of overprescription and of polypharmacy are really strong. It's really strong at the moment in many countries, the UK, the US. And here, what I would call the triple win. So we've started to use a framework which the C framework. It's an application, a sort of an extension of the triple bottom line to healthcare. And so the three P's, three C's: clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and carbon effectiveness. So a triple win would be one where all of those are served. And I think in overprescription, that is often the case, and the main driver for wanting to tackle an overprescription polypharmacy is because of the negative clinical impact that it has on people, having extra side effects, the safety, or it's already sold on that we're having the clinical wins of reducing that. Well, straightforward reduction is much easier than substitutions for people. So in the carbon, that anesthetics has been easier to sort of roll out conceptually, and actually than inhalers. This here swapping from desflurane, which is a very the highest impact anesthetic, also expensive, but you can swap it for another one that's equally clinically effective and actually costs less. So that's been, and again, the NHS has now said that will happen across the NHS. Inhalers, it's more, it offers a really interesting case study there, I think, because just swapping out your high global warming potential inhaler for a lower one isn't necessarily the best option. Often you want to have better management of asthma, and actually that prevention piece is going to be more impactful and better for the patient. But also people they have their inhaler uses. It's really important people have an inhaler that is working for them. not to sort it out because of the carbon impact. So it allows us a way to sort of tackle some of those. But here, I think for us, the prevention is articulating the carbon benefits alongside the clinical and the cost benefits. So one of the collaborations we're doing is with an excellent program in the US run by the Veterans VA hospital systems, a very big system across the US. And they have a program of tackling overprescription called Bio. This is now rolled out across all of their hospitals in many of the hospitals in the States. They've already articulated the number of benefits they can do clinical and the cost savings that an efficacy have. Now we can come in and bring in what the carbon savings of that. And they're very substantial. So now you can tick multiple boxes. You can potentially drive forward prevention of harms from overprescription. You can save money there. You can show that you're starting to have an impact, and maybe we can scale that out. So that's the kind of way we're sort of thinking about how they can be really useful in new maker. And for a small organization, I think trying to potentially think about those foundations, frameworks, narrative frameworks, systemic ways, and then for us to use data, we can really exemplify that and show that. That's where we see we can potentially have a bigger impact.
That just about wraps it up quite neatly for this episode. I think in conclusion, there's so many things to pick up on here, but the 3 C's is definitely one thing that I believe a lot of our audience will have as a key takeaway to look at the clinical effectiveness, the cost effectiveness, and the carbon effectiveness when you're evaluating something, and that collaboration is difficult and needed across the segment. Nazneen, this conversation has been delightful. I've really learned a lot. I hope that the online timing hasn't been too disturbing for our listeners, because I've been feeling like we could talk for hours and hours on end. But you have also agreed to come back on the show and talk more about the angles and the responsibilities of boards in this industry. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And without saying too much about what we're going to go over in that episode, thank you so much for sharing your insights on UMake and your insights in the industry, and for the work that you're doing. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that our listeners are going to appreciate all of the insights that you've shared today.
Thanks very much. It's been really enjoyable.
Cool. Cheers.